From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peggy Pearlstein. I'm head of the Hebraic section here at the Library of Congress in the African and Middle Eastern Division. Welcome to today's program and book signing with Janice Rothschild Blumberg. She'll be talking about her newest book, Prophet in the Time of Priests, Rabbi Alphabet Brown, 1845 to 1929. Since May is Jewish American Heritage Month, the story of this Hungarian-born American rabbi is especially fitting. I also want to draw your attention to a program that we're going to have on May 13th, also in observance of Jewish American Heritage Month, when local filmmaker Aviva Kempner will talk and show film clips from her new special DVD edition of the life and times of baseball player Hank Greenberg. And I've also put out on the tables, and they're up front as well, if you'd like to be added to our email list for upcoming programs, just fill this out. We'll collect them afterwards, and we're happy to let you know what's coming up in the future. I've known Janice for many years. She lived in Washington, and before that, she's from her native Atlanta, Georgia. So we're both Southerners, since I'm a native of Charleston, South Carolina. We've both been active in the Southern Jewish Historical Society, of which Janice is a past president. And we both have been active in the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington, of which I'm a past president. In addition, Janice has served with distinction in national organizations. For many years, she was a member of the board of the American Jewish Historical Society, and from 1991 to 1998, she was chair of the board of the B'nai B'rith Klutznick National Jewish Museum here in Washington. Janice has experienced American history and American Jewish history at close range as the wife and now widow of two outspoken Jewish leaders, Rabbi Jacob M. Rothschild of Atlanta and David M. Blumberg of Knoxville, Tennessee. Blumberg was the international president of B'nai B'rith from 1971 to 1978. Janice's first husband, Rabbi Rothschild, was a well-known civil rights activist. One Voice, Rabbi Jacob M. Rothschild and the Troubled South, tells the story of Rothschild's work for equal rights for all, especially for African Americans. It was his activism that led to the bombing of his synagogue, known as the Temple. In As But a Day, Janice chronicled the history of Atlanta's Hebrew Benevolent Congregation. She also co-authored a book called Deadly Truth, a novel based upon actual events in South Africa under apartheid, and she's written for newspapers, scholarly journals, and the Encyclopedia Judaica. Today we'll learn about another of Janice's encounters with American Jewish history at close range, this time as the great-granddaughter of Rabbi Alphabet Brown, whose life sheds light on the development of American Judaism. Through careful research, much of it done here at the Library of Congress, Janice Rothschild Blumberg gives us the story of an unusual, colorful, and accomplished man. This event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's website and other media. The audience is encouraged to offer comments and raise questions during the formal question and answer period, but please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of the event. By participating in the question and answer period, you're consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And now, a warm welcome for Janice Rothschild Blumberg.
Thank you.
We're very Southern today.
And I couldn't have done it without you, literally, Peggy. I'm just thrilled to be here, which I certainly couldn't have been without you. And I don't think I could have completed the book without your help. And certainly not, it would never have even started to happen without the facilities of this wonderful building. I had no training for historical work. This is all, learning on the job. And when I started, I thought, well, the way you find out about presidential connections that this great-grandfather might have had to check on things that we thought we knew, you write to the museums. They didn't have libraries for presidents back in the 19th century, and the congregations that he had been to. I didn't get any response from any of them until one day I happened to meet, or be connected rather, with Tweed Roosevelt. A mutual friend told him that about a friend who had some papers from letters from his great-grandfather to her great-grandfather, me, and he wanted to find out about those letters. So we were corresponding, and he called me one day to thank me when I had sent him copies of my letters, and he said, by the way, have you seen the rest of that correspondence? It's in the Library of Congress. And I lived right here in Washington, and it never occurred to me that it was here. Well, that opened up not just Theodore Roosevelt's letters, but packets from Harrison, from Taft, but those collections were right here on microfilm, and I would never have known this otherwise. You could get just anything you wanted. The people there were very patient with me because they could tell I didn't know what I was doing. And I appreciated it, and I was able to get the copies of his testimony before congressional committees over in the Madison building. The prayer one of the prayers that he gave in Congress, which I will read to you later. So, as I said, these buildings are a national asset that not enough people know about, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful to them. Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. Now, Edward Benjamin Morris Brown was, as Peggy told you, my great-grandfather, and he lived until I was 5 years old. So I do have one specific memory of him. And I even have a picture taken that day. I was about 3 years old. The picture's in the back of the book of me with him. We were playing a game. We had a little ledge by our front steps, and I would jump from there, and he would catch me. And, as little kids do, I was doing it over and over again. And when he got tired, he didn't catch me. He just let me fall to the ground. I wasn't hurt. Picked me up. He hugged me and brushed me off. And he said, now, let this be a lesson to you. Never trust a Hungarian, even if he's your own great-grandfather. So this particular Hungarian was born in Slovakia, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in 1845. In 1865, just a few months after Appomattox, he took one of the first steamships that was open for passengers, for the public, to America. And very shortly after that, he was taken in by Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, who was then in the process of organizing American Judaism. There wasn't any Reform Orthodox conservative in those days In fact, he was then trying to establish a seminary for training American rabbis. He wasn't dividing up. In fact, it's questionable as to whether he was responsible for the fact that they did eventually divide up. He really wanted a unified American Hebrew congregational union. Now, so he made this young rabbi who already had 3 degrees in Europe, one of which was theological, Jewish, but he wanted to train him for the American rabbinate before there was a college. And he brought him into his own home as a member of the family. Well, that wasn't enough work for Brown, so he found a medical college that was on the same, they call it College Hill in Cincinnati, at least in those days they did. And so he got a medical degree while he was studying rabbinics for America with Wise. Then one of his first pulpits, his first 2 pulpits, he was very unsuccessful. He stayed just a few weeks in each one, but this one was in Wisconsin, and he had already signed up for a law degree at the University of Wisconsin. So he stayed long enough in Madison to get his law degree, and after that he signed his name E.B.M. Brown, LLD A.M.B.M. D.D.M.D., and that's why they called him Alphabet. So, now Wise, who actually taught most of the rabbis who were in America at that time, understood that in this country, rabbis were no longer had the same role that they had in Europe. They were not appointed by the state to run every aspect of a person's life. In fact, they were not really necessary, sort of like dessert after a good meal. It was nice to have them, but people didn't consider them really essential. And so he advised his students that rabbis should be, and I quote, very circumspect, particularly in an age and in a country where rabbis are looked upon as ice cream only. Well, Alphabet Brown could not be compared to ice cream. Ben and Jerry would not be able to find a flavor for him. And I believe that if you want a culinary metaphor for him, he was like Hungarian goulash. It's hearty, it's spicy, nutritious, and for many people hard to digest. And that describes him. Brown had 13 different congregations in 8 states in a career that lasted for over half a century. But while he was serving congregations, he also wrote and translated books, published 3 newspapers, including the South's first Jewish newspaper, which was interesting. He lectured in churches and public halls across the country. That was the big thing that he was good at and successful at. Taught courses in mental health at a medical college, gave opening prayers in Congress to each house, not once but twice, helped Benjamin Harrison win the White House, developed lifelong friendship with Ulysses S. Grant and the Grant family, served as an honorary pallbearer in Grant's funeral, badgered Presidents McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson to establish a Jewish chaplaincy, appealed unjust legal judgments, really, in effect, ruining his own reputation by doggedly staying on a case of a man who was falsely accused and convicted of murdering his wife, and that's in the book. Part of his own brief that he took to Governor David Hill of New York to get a stay of execution for this man, I have put in the book as an addendum because the wording and the details are just so interesting that I wanted to share them. He also discussed the Jewish question with Pope Leo XIII, received honors from the Sultan of Turkey and advised Theodore Herzl, among other matters, that if the Sultan wouldn't give him land for a Jewish state in Palestine, he could get plenty of it for him in Florida. And he didn't mean Miami. He actually had been offered land for a Jewish settlement in the Panhandle. This man by the name of Plant, who was developing the west coast of Florida, Brown met with this company, and they offered him land for a Jewish settlement for an agricultural community. That Brown had the idea when he found out that the Chattahoochee River, which divides Georgia and Alabama, and flows into the Gulf of Mexico in Florida, in Panhandle, that there were lots of cotton mills in Columbus, and they had built a dam on the Chattahoochee just above Columbus that was going to expand these cotton mills tremendously. And Brown had the idea that a Jewish farm settlement could supply this extra need that they would be having for cotton. Well, it didn't happen. And the reason that it didn't happen, Brown even had his partner in this scheme was the chief rabbi of France, Zadok Khan, and Rabbi Khan was also the head of the De Hirsch Foundation, which guaranteed the money for settlement. We even have a letter from a steamship captain about taking the people, making arrangements for taking these people from Fiume on the Adriatic, so they wouldn't have to cross Europe, actually, to Savannah, Georgia. And the Southern Railroad had agreed to take them to Florida. So he had all of this arranged. And why didn't it happen? Well, that's not even what I was going to tell you today, but I thought it was fascinating. It didn't happen because it was in 1896, just about the time that Herzl was trying to organize the first Zionist Congress. And the people who had signed up to come to this colony in America, which was unknown to them, decided that they'd rather wait and see what Herzl had. And as Brown said, they preferred starvation in Palestine to opulence in the United States. So they didn't get here. Now, there's much more to it that's in the book, but you don't have time for it today. Brown frequently made more friends among the important Christians than he did among the important Jews. In fact, when he first went to Atlanta, the governor of Georgia appointed him to be Georgia's delegate to a World Congress of Social Science in Sweden that was to take place the following summer. He never got there because my great-grandmother gave birth to their second child, and it was sick. I think it must have been what we know as postpartum depression. But he stayed with her over the summer, didn't get to that meeting. But what's interesting about the meeting is the subject of the lecture that he prepared for it, which became one of his 3 most popular public lectures. And the title of it is How the Chosen People Stay Sober and Out of Mischief. Well, there was a big Protestant revival going on in America in those days, so they were not only interested in things Jewish, but there was also a big problem with temperance. This was the forebear to our prohibition, but when it was getting started, there was a great interest in how immigrants are able to stay sober and out of mischief. Well, in addition to that, there were this tremendous interest among Christians in not only in Jewish people whom they were meeting for the first time, but because they were ardent Protestants in reviving their interest in their Old Testament, they wanted to know what these people believed. And so one of the other lectures which which really gets to me that he was able to do this and it was so popular with a non-Jewish audience, was the title of it was The Crucifixion of Christ, or Have the Jews Actually Crucified Jesus of Nazareth? Well, remarkably, his thesis coincided with the Gospel of Judas, the Judas Gospel, which wasn't even discovered in the original for almost 100 years after this, and it wasn't available to the public in translation until 1990s. So how did he know? I have no idea. But if you read the lecture was reviewed almost in entirety in the Columbus, Georgia newspaper, and that was his thesis. Anyway, the other most popular lecture was one that he gave in Washington at it was Ethics of the Talmud, and he gave it in the winter of 1881 at the Mount Vernon Place Methodist Episcopal Church here in Washington. Interestingly enough, he defined the Talmud for non-Jews as being to the Torah, the law, what the congressional record is to the American Constitution. When you think about this, it makes a lot of sense, because the Constitution states what the law is, and the congressional record states the usage of it and argues the points about it when they're disputed. And this is exactly what you find in the Talmud with Jewish law. So I like that. Now, in addition to being substantive, a reviewer from Washington Star reviewed it highly, but said he was more humorous than Mark Twain. Now, can you imagine that with a lecture on the Talmud? And this, despite the fact that he was nursing an injured leg, and he had just left Atlanta, where he was so badly libeled with this scandal that he knew he was going to be looking for a job. Now, it's debatable as to whether he was fired or resigned, but the question was that he was looking for a job, and that's what brought him to Washington for the second time that we know of. Now, a former governor, a congressman, a current senator from Illinois, all had endorsed him for a diplomatic post. And President Garfield had said that he was going to recommend this to Congress as soon as Congress finished a particular filibuster it was into. I don't know what the subject was, but the filibuster lasted so long that news of the scandal from Atlanta got here, and the president reneged on his promise. But he did give Brown an interview appointment to come and speak to him about it in person. Now, unfortunately, it was for the afternoon of July the 2nd, and I'm sure you all know what happened on the morning of July 2nd, 1881 in Washington. Garfield was assassinated. So Brown never got the appointment. He did get a job, however, as a rabbi of a small congregation in New York, uptown, but not prestigious at all. And this was just at the time when the tsunami of immigrants was inundating the government and certainly the Jewish community, because so many of them were Eastern European Jews. He and my great-grandmother went every day to Ellis Island. I'm sorry, there was no Ellis Island yet, to Castle Harbor, which was another reason they didn't have the facilities of Ellis Island. This was one of the causes of so much exploitation and bad stuff going on there. So my grandmother used to tell me that she never knew who was going to be in the kitchen when she came home from school every day, because her mother would be particularly careful to bring any young Jewish women who were traveling alone home with them until she could get them a regular job and a regular place to live. And philanthropist Jacob Schiff had given a great deal of money for what they call the Schiff Shelter on Ward's Island to take care of these, as many of the immigrants as possible until they got settled. But things were bad even there, and a lot of them wanted to go back to Europe, believe it or not. So in order to help them do this, Brown, the rabbi, prevailed upon his friend Senator Holt Folger from New York to get him an appointment with President Arthur. That was his second trip, a third trip that I know of to Washington. And he did succeed in getting the president to promise them a government transport to take the people back to Europe who wanted to go. In the meantime, it didn't happen because of what was written up in the New York papers, believe it or not, as the Tzimmus riot. Does everybody know what tzimmus is? It's a very delicious dish, basically carrots and sweet potatoes and so forth. That is a holiday dish. And this was a Sabbath dinner, and at the Schiff Shelter they were serving tzimmus, among other things, and one man asked for a second helping. And when the server refused to give it to him, he had just had it with frustration, and he grabbed the ladle, hit the server over the head with it, and a riot broke out. And that's what made the president change his mind, and the return ship was not sent to bring them back. But I thought that was funny that they would actually say tzimmus in the New York papers. Not surprisingly, Brown's relationship with the establishment was not a good one, because the philanthropists, the ultra-reformed Jews from Temple Emmanuel were accustomed to being the spokespeople and also financially responsible for anybody any Jews who needed help. Sort of like a Jewish Vatican, because they really did look after and also rule to the extent that they could. And they didn't realize that they were no longer in the majority, that getting into the 1880s, there was a whole large group of Jewish people who were becoming citizens of this country, and they lived in downtown New York, and they didn't have a voice. So this situation led to a lot of controversy with Brown. And one of the things that he opposed them on for so long, it's very hard to understand, but they were opposed to his pushing the public school district to excuse Jewish children on the high holy days. And one of the rabbis even reported in the newspaper that he would send his own children to school. What was wrong with that? Well, of course, there's a lot wrong with that. And Brown had applied not only for Jewish children, but Catholic children were also discriminated against. And it was for Jewish children on the high holy days and for Catholic children on Good Friday. As I said, the establishment argued this. He had to argue it for 4 years, and the school system just they completely ignored him. He fought that for 4 years. Finally, got all kinds of affidavits from rabbis all over the world and school superintendents from all over this country, took it to the State Assembly in Albany and won the case. So this was the kind of person he was. Now, he really angered the establishment most when he was invited to be a pallbearer representing the Jewish people of America in Grant's funeral. Don't know if you have read much or heard much about it, but I didn't realize what a tremendous thing this was. This was larger and more publicized and so forth even than Lincoln's funeral. New York people were paying $30 a piece for a space in a window on the procession which went from the Battery to Riverside Park, where the Tube is now. Now, Brown horrified the establishment even more by saying that he would have to walk because it was on Shabbat. The establishment knew perfectly well that he was a Reform rabbi, and being of the Reform persuasion, there was nothing wrong with riding on Shabbat. So why was he doing it? Because he realized that he was representing all the Jewish people, not just the ones uptown that he happened to belong to, but that wasn't the point. The general in charge of arrangements for the funeral refused to let him do it. So he simply sent a telegram to his friend Fred Grant, the president's son, saying that, quote, "Since I cannot honor both my religion and your sainted father, I would have to forego the honor." Whereby the next day, of course, the general got his orders from the family, and the orders were to let the rabbi do what he wants to do, so he walked. And not only did the Orthodox Jews appreciate it to the point of actually striking a medal depicting him wearing the badge of a mourner, but they had a big reception to present it and everything. The Christian ministers, who were having a pretty hard time getting their people to observe their Sabbath in the same numbers that they used to do, was so pleased that they took turns walking with him from the Battery to Riverside Park. So, as I said, what is it that you win the battle but lose the war? That was sort of typical of him. Now, the ultimate indiscretion in their eyes was the defense of this innocent man, which I told you about, and you'll just have to read it. It's too long for me to get into details today, unless you wanted to stay until lunchtime tomorrow. But this was really a fascinating story of how he saved a man's life, and just saving his life wasn't enough. Brown persisted until he could get him totally exonerated, because he was innocent, and totally freed. This elderly man was in Sing Sing all those years. Took Brown 15 years and 4 governors of New York before he was able to achieve it. And then it had some political arm twisting, or he wouldn't have been able to do it. Now, he claimed that he never meddled in politics, but I argue that point, and it's true that he never ran for political office, but to say that he never meddled is a matter of semantics. He certainly had his hand in it. He began as a Democrat. He had experience in the South during Reconstruction. Don't forget, things were pretty rough. And also his mentor at the time, he broke with Wise later, but his mentor in his first years here was Rabbi Wise, who remained a strong Democrat all of his life. Then, when Brown was in New York, he perceived that the Republicans were the ones who were going to support education. And in fact, the Union League Club of New York appointed him to head a committee to lobby for passage of the Blair Bill, which was an attempt to fund public education in states that couldn't afford it. And I imagine that there was a lot of opposition, because a lot of those states, a lot of opposition from the Democrats at that time, because the states that mostly needed it were southern states impoverished by the war. At any rate, he became an ardent Republican at that point. He was always a strong advocate for labor. He embraced the theories of Henry George and the single tax theory, and at one point spoke out at a labor rally in Union Square, and apparently was so eloquent that not only did did the I'm sorry, the labor, it was a labor rally, but the James Blaine, the Republican candidate for president at that time, was the main speaker, and Brown had spoken out on his behalf, but it was so eloquent and so pro-labor that the newspapers called him the champion of the toiling. The newspapers called him Rabbi Brown, the poor man's friend, and Henry George added, and champion of the toiling masses. I think I'm going to skip over a little bit of this because there's too much. Brown got very much involved politically with Harrison, for Harrison's campaign. He was asked to come in and help get the Jewish vote in Harrison's home state, Indiana, where because of an anti-Semitic incident that Harrison didn't have anything to do with, but the man who did was on the same ticket. And the Republicans were afraid that Harrison would lose his home state and the election. And my great-grandmother's father was Brown's father-in-law was an active Republican in Indiana. So he asked him to come in and see what he could do to help influence the Jewish vote. And at the same time, they asked Brown to try to help in Ohio because he had connections there. And in Ohio, Wise's newspapers were very much pro-Democrat, and they were afraid that they needed some help there with the Jewish vote. The Jewish vote in those states apparently was considered the swing vote. And also in New York, Brown had organized a group of a fairly large group of working class Jewish men in downtown New York under the title, the Hebrew American Republican League, to help Fred Grant in campaign for Secretary of State of New York the year before. And even though Grant lost, Brown gained all of this feeling for campaigning and for politics. So he organized this league in New York to help get the vote in the presidential election for Harrison. This was 1888. And it did bring in New York and Indiana. And he felt that he was entitled. That was in a day of rampant patronage and cronyism. And he had gotten these working people to volunteer their time and so forth through the promise of a little bit of patronage. And apparently the Harrison administration wasn't at all interested. They completely forgot about them. They got nothing, even an assistant postmaster in Chitlin Switch. They got nothing. And this really hurt Brown, and very much. It did not stop him from being an activist politically. But after that, he was badly affected emotionally, and I think the onset of dementia started then. And he I'm sorry. He stopped doing things in those areas, but he was very much involved. He became almost obsessed with the idea of a Jewish chaplaincy. There had been chaplains specifically appointed to serve Jewish men in the Civil War in certain companies. But after the Spanish-American War, during the Spanish-American War, apparently Brown got a lot of messages from letters from families and so forth of instances where their sons fighting abroad in the Philippines particularly needed the services of a rabbi. And so he tried very hard to get that. He was not successful. They eventually did it. Wilson did it, but not during the time that Brown was trying to get him to do it. He did it when we got into World War I, because the Union of American Hebrew Congregations got behind it. And that's when it did happen, that there was the chaplaincy as we know it now that takes care of cadets at the academies as well as whatever issues there are throughout the year, whether or not we are at war. Now, I want to leave time for questions, so hopefully. Brown, as early as 1910, was inspired by Princeton's president, thinking that it would be great if Princeton's president became president of the United States, and that's when he returned to the Democratic Party and started pushing for Woodrow Wilson. Why? Because he said Wilson was a man with religious principles who would guide the country toward fulfilling the promise of America for all Americans. And that phrase, the promise of Americans, summed up Brown's mission, basically. When I got through all of this business that he was in this and he was in that all over the place, at the bottom of it, it was really trying to hold people's feet to the fire, and particularly the government's, to make the promise of America a reality. He took it seriously. It was not just a catchphrase with him, and in little ways. Now, because he felt that we needed prodding, we needed constant prodding. Now, his major tactic was to bridge diversity, to help Jews and Christians to appreciate each other through interfaith dialogue. And things we take for granted today, they were not ready for in those days. We speak freely and openly. Our ancestors were too early from Europe to be able to feel really comfortable in a mixed society, but he was. And he also knew the phraseology that non-Jews would plug into because it was familiar. And any of you who went to school in a predominantly Christian place, which I did in Georgia, will find some of these very familiar from the prayer we said in schools, public schools, every day. But I want to read to you the example, or one example, of how he was able to do what he did. And it's through the prayer that he gave. Actually, it was about the same prayer that he gave in both the Senate and the House. This happens to be from the House. In December 13th, 1917, when, if you remember, Woodrow Wilson, a scholarly president, was struggling with a contentious, divided Congress to ratify his plan for a lasting peace. And I want to close with the prayer. Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom came with the dawn of creation, and being established upon principles eternal and universal, its laws enforce themselves alike in all climes and all ages. Therefore, thy will must be done amongst the celestials in heaven, even as it is done amongst thy mortal children on earth. Thou hast endowed nature with productive energies subservient to man's will, whereby thou givest us this day our daily bread. By imparting to us thy divine spirit, thou hast enabled us to enact just laws which guard human society, so that human passions may not lead us into temptation, but by divine grace deliver us from all evil. For the purpose of enacting just laws for our great nation, there are here assembled its representative sons. And I pray that as thou wast with Moses on the peak of Moab, so here in this modern Sinai, thou canst send thy Shekinah upon every one of its representatives present, so that while they represent the will of the people, They will represent the will of Thee, who art our Father and our Lord. And we pray, O God, our special blessing upon the President of the United States, our olive branch president, who is waging an olive branch war in order to bring about an olive branch peace amongst all the nations of the earth. Open thy religious magnanimity to forgive those who trespass against us, even as thou forgivest our trespasses against thee. And thus give us the power and the will to bring mankind to thy feet as children of God, and to democratize every human being in justice and in equality. We thank thee, O Lord, that you have selected our nation as the chosen people of these days to bring about the peace which the bewildered world now wants. But let us not be vainglorious at the high position assigned us, bearing in mind that whatsoever we are in greatness, in influence, in power, we are so only through thee. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. Do I have time for questions?
You do, yes. Any questions? Janice has a couple of minutes before she does a book signing, so we'll be happy to entertain any ideas or questions you might have. Yes.
Thank you for this talk. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the research. I wondered if one of the big cause celebs that became something that the establishment Jewish community took on as a cause was taken on by Rabbi Brown. That is the Leo Frank case. That would have been when he was much later in his life, obviously.
That's a very good question. Do all of you know the Leo Frank case? He didn't. I didn't find it. The only reference I found to that was at some point, I forget now who he was addressing, but he referred to connecting what had happened in New York with the case that he was on with what Governor Slayton did, commuting the case of Leo Frank. Here you had somebody who was, in both cases, obviously innocent, with the only evidence to the contrary was drummed up evidence. And so the answer is no, he didn't have anything to do with it. By then, he was lobbying Congress for a chaplaincy. Mark.
Do you know how and how quickly you learned English?
How what?
How quickly he learned English and
Oh,
how he did.
You know, that's interesting because he claimed that he learned it after he came to America. His family, the town that he lived in Slovakia, was German speaking, and the Jews were German speaking. And so he grew up German speaking in his home. He learned Hebrew because he was a boy. He and his two sisters had a French tutor, so he learned French. He learned Magyar and Yiddish on the streets because when he was a teenager, the Hasids were coming in from across the mountains from Romania. And so he knew all of those languages. He didn't know English. He learned that after he came to America. But he had apparently a photographic mind. They showed him off when he was a child. He was, I think, exploited by his family and the community when they would have a fundraiser or something at the temple or their synagogue. He could quote Talmud, which I understand that young kids are not even supposed to read no matter how smart they are. He could quote a passage of Talmud at random by just mentioning it or opening it or whatever. So he learned learned English very quickly, and anything else he wanted to know. Anything else? Jill.
One of the things that I found most fascinating about your book is the period of American Jewish history that it covers from the 1860s to the 1920s, a period that I really didn't know much about before. And
Yes.
The question, repeat the question.
He fell out of favor with Wise, and Wise was really the arbiter of Judaism in America. Now, Judaism being when I use this term, I'm talking about reform with a small r, reformers, which ended up conservative and reform, and they were the only people who were heard, who had a voice. And he went against the grain, and I really do think that their grain, and I really do believe that just as in the Soviet Union, they could blank out somebody from history, I think that's what they tried to do. And Rabbi Gary Zola, who's head of American Jewish Archives now, convinced me that I should do this seriously. This book started out to be a mystery story, because this murder case that I told you about, and I had the whole brief, so it sounded like a wonderful story. And Rabbi Zola talked me into doing it seriously with footnoting, because he said that he felt that the same thing had happened. He had been written out, and there was a lot more there to find, and if I didn't have the training or the scholarship to do the complete job, that by opening it up, hoping people would read this book, that maybe some really good scholar in the future will do that. But it's got a lot of footnotes. I think you'll find a fair amount of scholarship. I had to do all of that in order to prove that all of these things that we heard were true, because they all sounded like they couldn't possibly have happened, and they did. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.